Alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And in a very good evening, you're with me, Dr. Muhammad Husni Mohd Amin, Senior Research Officer at IKIM Center for Science and Environment Studies, or short as KIAS. Following this program, Great Works of the Muslim World, produced by Maslina Ismail on Radio IKIM. So, Alhamdulillah, for this episode, we will be deliberating on this topic, Al-As'ilah wal-Ajwibah, uh, the Ibn Sina and al-Biruni exchange on science and metaphysics. So today we are joined by Dr. Muhammad Imran Mustafa Abdul Khudus, Senior Lecturer at the Department of Physics, Faculty of Science, University of Malaya. Welcome, Dr. Imran, to Great Works of the Muslim World. So how are you today?
Alhamdulillah, I'm good. How are you, Husni?
I'm good. We're fine. We're working from home with the recent increase in COVID cases. So, to start off, why don't you tell us briefly what you do for a living?
Right. So I'm a physicist working at University of Malaya,
Yeah.
and my specialization is in optoelectronics. So specifically nonlinear optics and UV generation. So we do play with lasers and high power lasers and UV LEDs and stuff like that. Generally,
Yeah. So it makes you a bona fide scientist.
I suppose so.
All right. So going into our topic today, so maybe you want to give us a short introductions to each of our towering figures today, namely Ibn Sina and al-Biruni. Who were they, and how did we come to corresponding to each with each other?
Right. So these two giants of the intellectual Muslim world lived
Yes.
in an age where the Muslim civilization was at its peak, as it were. But the Muslim world was politically fractured, so there were different states and sultanates all over the place. The caliphate did exist, but it existed only in name, in a sense. Ibn Sina himself, or his full name, Abu Ali al Husayn ibn Abdullah ibn Sina, was born in about 980 of the Common Era near Bukhara in Central Asia, which is now in Uzbekistan. So he was a prodigy since his early years and was recognized as such by his peers. Memorized the Quran at the age of 10 and spent the next few years studying different types of knowledge, including Islamic law, philosophy, natural sciences, or natural philosophy. At 13, he started studying the medical sciences. And before the age of 20, he was already established as a remarkable physician. Because of his fame, he was summoned to different courts to treat leaders of the Muslim world, including the Sultan of Bukhara as well as Mahmud Ghaznavi. So he traveled extensively around the Muslim world, writing and teaching. Nowadays, Ibn Sina is probably most famous for his contribution to medicine, his Qanun fi Tib. But that time, he was also very well known for his philosophical treatises, and he was probably the foremost philosopher in the so-called peripatetic tradition in the Muslim world at that time. He died at 1037 at the age of 57 and was buried at Hamadan. Now, al-Biruni, or Abu Rayhan Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Biruni, is probably less well known. He was born about 973 of the Common Era at the Khwarizm region in Central Asia near the Oxus River. We don't have accounts of his early life, but he was like Ibn Sina, was also a prodigy and was well known for his scholarship. And he moved around in different cities and courts due to his reputation as a scholar. Nowadays, al-Biruni is probably most well known for his work in mathematical astronomy, as it were, where his books deal primarily with the heavens and things like methods of calculating the Qibla and stuff like that, as well as his book on the Indians, the so-called Kitab al-Hind, which is arguably one of the earliest book of anthropology which existed. So during his moving between different places in a city called Gurgan, apparently he met Ibn Sina, and that kind of started this exchange of letters, which we now have, which we call the Al-As'ila wal Ajwiba, which is one of the few. So there are several As'ila wal Ajiba, which literally just translates as questions and answers. But al-Biruni had one on something, a different topic, but this is probably the one that is most well known, and it deals with matters of physics and the nature of the universe, as it were.
So we're looking at this work here, book published by the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, ISTAC, and this particular work was published in 1995, and we're lucky to have people, great scholars such as Professor Syed Hossein Nasar and also Professor Mehdi Mohagik, who have edited this book, and for us to for our reading pleasure today. Right. So from what you have just described, Dr. Imran, one is a physician turned philosopher, and the other one was a mathematician turned astronomer, and also anthropologist. I mean, the first, the father of modern anthropology. Now, with regards to the scientific and metaphysical dimensions of their correspondence, their exchange of letters, uh, what can you say as the pertinent points which you came across while scrutinizing this work?
Right. The work that came down to us is in a form. It's a question and answers, right? So it came
Yes.
down to us in a form of kind of two complete sets of questions and answers by al-Biruni and Ibn Sina, and then like an extension of that, which was done by al-Biruni and one of Ibn Sina's pupils. Now, we have 5 of the letters which were written by Ibn Sina and al-Biruni themselves, or dictated by them. And the final letter was written by, but the final response was written by al-Masumi, who was one of Ibn Sina's former student. So the first letter was written by Ibn Sina, the one that we had, but it was in response to questions that were posed by al-Biruni on certain matters about the heavens, right? So it deals with Aristotle's work on the heaven, and it deals with issues such as the nature of gravity, how many directions which exists, mathematical issues, the possibility of other worlds, the spherical movements of heavenly bodies, and stuff like this. So generally, the physics, as it were, of that age. So Ibn Sina's reply was to give like a point by point, in a sense, reply to these questions. And al-Biruni seemed to have not been satisfied with the answers. So he replied to Ibn Sina's reply to his questions, specifying other issues, including the possibility of a vacuum, which is a really, really pertinent point. And then how objects changes their volume with respect to heat and stuff like this. Things like why ice floats, for instance, and so on was discussed. So in general, it discusses the kind of it is in a very real sense. It's a physics of the universe, as it were. But al-Biruni picks on specific problems which exists within the Aristotelian explanation of the physics, which is linked to a certain extent to the metaphysics, and try and get some clarification and see whether or not these answers actually make any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is fascinating because when you said that he was explaining it with a certain point from Aristotelian paradigm, it seems that it sounded like he has taken that's what people describe Ibn Sina and his paradigm is an Avicennan, which is actually Aristotelian, with Aristotelian paradigm with regards to how they see the physical universe. But interestingly, Aristotle himself, he was a Greek philosopher. He was a metaphysician, and so was Ibn Sina. Now, what can you explain to us the metaphysics of that time, namely from Ibn Sina and al-Biruni? I mean, Ibn Sina, he was one of the what we call the Masyaiyun, or the peripatetic philosopher. He must have ideas about density, about how the earth during that time they held on to geocentrism, the belief that the earth is at the center of the universe. Maybe you can elaborate more on that.
So now the word physics and metaphysics probably has a slightly different connotation, and at least methodological difference between what they used then and what we use now. Physics is in still is and was and still is in some sense the attempt to describe reality, but the methodology used by them differs significantly from what we physicists would do today. And metaphysics, meaning you study being as its own subject. This chapter came after the physics, so it is meta, which means after the physics. So they used to call it first philosophy or something like that. So it's the foundations of reality, as it were. Now, in terms of the physics themselves, itself, methodologically, if we look at the way they do things, there was, in a sense, less reliance on experimental deliberations as being more conclusive in deciding physical explanations. Much more credence given to ancient authorities, especially Aristotle, in the discussions of physics. So what Aristotle says becomes a kind of standard for which everything is explained by. So there are experiments which were conducted to test certain ideas. So things like whether or not water, for instance, al-Biruni talks about when water freezes, it expands, right? But the explanation given in Aristotelian physics is something like, if heat is applied, then it will expand. So al-Biruni was saying, how does this work, right? So there are experiments being conducted, but the interpretation of those experiments were typically done within the Aristotelian worldview. So for instance, right. So in terms of the system as a whole, they believed that the world is spherical, as it were. So they knew that the world was spherical. They didn't believe that the world was flat, but they believed that the world was surrounded by different heavenly spheres, and each of these planets or wanderers in Greek inhibits these spheres, as it were. So you have the Earth, and then you have spheres which go outward from the Earth. So the Earth is in a very real sense the center of the universe.
Yeah.
And things like gravity and so on was explained by the so-called density, and then the tendency of water and earth to go towards the center of the earth, and things like fire and air to rise and stuff like that. So this is like the way they think about physics at that time. Of course, this view was later, 600 years later, mocked by people like Galileo, who actually observed planets around Jupiter, around other planets, right? So according to the Aristotelian system, this should not be possible because everything revolves around the sun. So in some sense, in terms of methodology, physics is typically subsumed under a larger kind of Aristotelian complete worldview, as it were. So everything is explained within that worldview in some sense.
Yeah, because I think that is brilliant, because it's only after Nicholas Copernicus' death in 1543 that after his ideas in the revolutionibus orbium celestium, that the idea began to gradually shift attention from Ptolemy's geocentric theory of the universe to a heliocentric idea. And according, I remember reading that according to Professor George Saliba, it was the influences of the Muslim astronomers in the 9th century, 13th century, and 14th century. People like MashaAllah, people like Mu'ayyaduddin al-Urdi, and also Nasiruddin at-Tusi in Ibn Shatir. These were the people whom Copernicus, whose works Copernicus had or referred to when forming his idea on his theory, Imran. So we were kind of wondering, how did the letters eventually end between Ibn Sina and al-Biruni?
So in a sense, well, in a sentence, not well. If you read the letters, the way it began was very cordial. So there were a lot of honorifics and stuff like that. As we go through the letters, it became less and less cordial. Well, and in some sense, it became, like there were insults being thrown around and stuff like that. Um,
Okay.
and it seems, if as I read the letters, what happened was al-Biruni became more and more frustrated by Ibn Sina's answers, as the answers weren't really answers. In some sense, it was like it was it was something like sophistry or something like that. Al-Biruni was saying, things must have a concept, or it must have a reality, as it were, not just playing with words, something along those lines. So Said Hussein Nasr, the one who translated, made the critical edition of this text, suggested that al-Biruni was more of an anti-Aristotelian, but perhaps it's better to view al-Biruni as being closer to what we would now call as an empiricist, which is someone who puts empirical consistency as being more important in terms of the explanations. So al-Biruni was asking, he really wanted to know in a consistent manner why these things happen. And Ibn Sina's answers were like a bit wishy-washy in that sense. So
Yeah.
then at the end of it, what happened was Ibn Sina essentially instructed his former student al-Masumi to answer al-Biruni's questions for him, and that kind of ended it. So after two sets, the last set of questions by al-Biruni was answered by Ibn Sina's student al-Masumi, and there was no reply after that. Even that reply was not complete because the letters were lost. So al-Biruni didn't answer after that, and looking at the answers given by al-Masumi, I wasn't sure that al-Biruni would have thought that they were satisfactory in any sense. But so the letters didn't end in a good way in some sense, and they do leave some of the issues which were brought up by al-Biruni being open rather than being resolved. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounded like, yeah, because we know that al-Biruni, he's the more he's the more scientist than Ibn Sina, although we don't deny that Ibn Sina himself, he had medical training, and then this must involve a certain kind of logic that you use when diagnosing and providing prognosis of ailments and other symptoms. But we see here that al-Biruni is the more scientist than Ibn Sina, perhaps because that's why he's left unsatisfactory with Ibn Sina more philosophical answers. But from there we can see that how the science is evolving, and maybe you'd like to share with us how physics have evolved since this correspondence between Ibn Sina and al-Biruni.
Right. So really the method of doing science and physics in this manner kind of continued for another, say, 500 600 years. The big break really came with the uh, Galileo, Descartes, and Newton.
Yeah.
So Copernicus did something, but Copernicus didn't insist on the reality of his system. He was more like, well, this is a nice mathematical system, and it kind of works
Yeah.
better, but let's not say that this is real in that manner. But then Galileo really did kind of push this by saying, that there are moons on other planets, and you have issues with all of these explanations. Then Descartes came and he brought about a kind of revolution in the mathematics of doing things. So the Cartesian plane, as it were, the XYZ plane that we still use, originates from Descartes in some sense. Um, and then he also had a physics which imagines, right? So the explanation given by Aristotelians as to why things go down were in terms of density and in terms of tendencies, as it were. The explanation given by someone like Descartes was that you have um, currents of materials which were circulating around objects, and this caused movements and attraction of bodies, right? And later, when Newton came about, Newton brought about a mathematization, mathematical kind of view. Like he unified, as it were, all of these different disparate observations and kind of put a mathematical equation on top of it, which is universal in their application. So since then, physics have in general moved in two directions. They are different directions, but they are complementary directions. It moved in towards a higher degree of empiricism. So it takes data, physical data, way more seriously. And then it moved to a higher degree of abstraction via mathematical description. So when Newton talked about his theory of gravity, Newton didn't really explain why the theory of gravity works. It just works, right? And so this abstraction, as it were, without having, so this abstraction, it's essentially mathematical, saying for some reason, if you have two objects, it will just attract one another, and this is the formula which does that, right?
Yeah.
So this kind of trend continued until the 19th century and the 20th century, where at that point everyone just became like used to thinking of the universe as just being mathematical. And probably the ultimate expression of this is something like the current standard model of particle physics, where it takes both empirical data and mathematical descriptions of reality. It is a standard model of particle physics. They take it very seriously, and for some reason it corresponds very well with reality, right?
Right.
But I guess what's lost is this connection between. So if you look at the Aristotelian worldview, everything kind of fits. Everything has a place, as it were. So science fits within a larger theory of the universe, of cosmology, and so on. What is lost in that sense is that this connection is severed in a sense, because we sort of stopped thinking about ultimate reason. We stopped at we seem to have stopped at the level of saying this formula is sufficient explanation for the universe itself. So nature, in some sense, it just exists, and for some reason, this nature is also mathematical. For reason, no one knows why.
Yeah. So so I think that concludes our conversation today. But what the interesting point that we got that as the physics goes on into the Western world, we seem to be getting a mechanized world picture. But talking about reality and mathematics, I think this will bring us to the second part, which I want to extract from the Al-Asilah wal Ajwibah. but not with you, Dr. Imran. So, but for today, I think that concludes, well, our conversation for today. And we thank you, Dr. Muhammad Imran Mustafa Abdul Khudus
Thank you.
from
Thank
Unity
you.
of Malaya for indulging us with this discussion on Al-Asilah wal-Ajwibah, on the science and metaphysics dimension of the correspondence. So, for our viewers, we will return next week with the second part of Al-Asilah wal-Ajwibah, Ibn Sina and al-Biruni exchange. But we will go with on the next discussion on reality and mathematics. We have special guests coming up next week, Dr. Muhammad Ikhwan Azlan. So until then, we end is with wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Assalamualaikum